Hurricane Harvey was not a catastrophe. That's what he wrote.
It's a blessing. It was a blessing. What was it?
He says, imagine the following scenario. A major metropolitan area with millions of people is hit by a natural disaster of unprecedented proportions. Everyone expects a catastrophe of biblical proportions. After the disaster passes, you learn the following. 99.5% of people are able to remain in their homes. 94% of homes suffered no damage. 0.0000075% of the population dies from the disaster, an increase in the annual death rate of about 0.1%. At any given point, more than 98% of Houstonians have electric power and 92% of Houstonians never lose power. City, county, corporate, nonprofit, and community leaders do a great job of responding to the disaster, as do state and federal government emergency management agencies. Average everyday citizens step up in a big way to take care of family, friends, and neighbors. The economic damage caused by the disaster is estimated to be less than 10% or to 20% of annual regional economic output, most of which is covered by insurance or tax deductibles. This is like someone who makes a salary of $60,000 having suffered a loss of $6,000 to $12,000. Houstonians don't have to imagine this scenario. We just lived it. But Hurricane Harvey was not a catastrophe. It was Houston's finest evidence that our distinctive approach to self-governance works, even under the stress of a major storm. Of course, many of us still have family, friends, and neighbors who are struggling with loss, and the response from people both within our metro area and around the nation, which has been heartwarming. And we will continue to work together to get those folks back on their feet. We always have, and we always will, because that's who we as Houstonians are. But there are some who are spinning a narrative that Houston's response was a failure. And they're trying to use this failure as a pretext for changing our formula for success. So Lindbeck is basically saying, let's not be economic girly men, people, right? Like let's not crack now and be economic girly men. Let this disaster become a moment of reflection and of scrutiny, right? Let's keep charging forward. So very interesting, right? Again, these particular discourses of risk. And certain types of risk-taking then are being celebrated. Now, I know that I'm going kind of long, and I want to wrap this up, and there's lots to show, hopefully, but I just want to get really quickly to the actual ethnographic data, because there isn't so much, a lot of this stuff is just from text and archival work, but this is the actual ethnographic data. So one of the things that Lindbeck and Jesse Coleman Holmes are telling you that you can only find out, that we found out through our ethnographic process, is the fact that when you begin to diversify and add to the voices and actually interview people about what risk is, then you get all kinds of interesting narratives, right? So Jesse Coleman Jones is saying, celebrating that we're now becoming the chemical capital of North America, but what has that done to Houstonians, and the fact that not all Houstonians have had to live through the impacts of this, and there has been much environmental injustice. So this is one of the largest petrochemical refining complexes in the United States. What you can't see in this photograph is that across the street there are houses. Houston prides itself in not having any zoning law. So in Houston, it's perfectly possible for you to come and open up a petrochemical refinery that is going to pump out massive amounts of benzene that is going to be carcinogenic, and it's going to cause very high levels of childhood leukemia. And they can do it in a residential zone because there are no codes governing this. Of course, they don't install these refineries in the neighborhoods of the elite. They install these refineries in the historically marginalized, predominantly Latino neighborhoods of the southwest of Houston, in an area called Buffalo Bayou, in particular in a neighborhood called Manchester, where childhood leukemia rates are through the roof. And what's really interesting about the political economy of petrochemical production in Houston is that of course, the city is very diverse, and you can't just say only white people live in one particular part of town, only wealthy people live in one particular part of town. But there are tendencies, right? There's certain overrepresentation of certain groups. And in terms of the political economy and the class structure of petrochemical production, there's an area here called the Energy Corridor, and that's where all the offices, the white-collar offices of the executives of the petroleum industry are. And the residential areas are to the west. And the toxic part of petrochemical production is spatially separated from them, right? And it's predominantly Latino and African American working class and working poor people, where the toxic elements of the refineries are placed, right? So there's an inequitable distribution of exposure risk in terms of toxicity, right? And that's one of the things that is important to keep in mind, because when Beck is writing Risk Society, he's arguing, with climate change, even the wealthy are going to be affected, and this might create some kind of solidarity, but even within Houston, not talking about climate change, talking about something like toxic risk, there isn't an equitably distributed, there's a very environmentally unjust distribution of toxic risk, right, of exposure to toxicity. And here's one member of the community talking about it. He said, one of the things that he was concerned with, his counter-narrative was that right now everyone's talking about flooding, but nobody wants to talk about the other risk in Houston, which is toxicity. He says, we had a toxic flood, so he's saying, people right now want to talk about water flooding, but you have to understand that we've been living for decades with a toxic flood, and it's an invisible one, and it's one that we constantly breathe, and it's causing very high levels of leukemia in the neighborhoods where he works. And he says, we are in a sacrifice zone, and we pay a price for the rest of the nation. So in that particular instance, it's not even about risk. They're just being sacrificed, right? There isn't a risk whether you're going to die of leukemia or not. Like, you are going to die of leukemia. It's just that this is the area that's been designated. Other forms of gentrification, of risk are gentrification, the danger of being displaced, right? So, and there's a link between this and flood risk, that a lot of Houston is a boom of construction. A big part of Houston's economy is a petrochemical industry. And this is the thing that when you think about America, and somebody asks you, mention a city in America, I think people, in my imagination, I usually think of New York City, I think of San Francisco, I think of Chicago. Houston isn't really prominent, right? And yet Houston is the fourth largest city in the country, and it really is a seat of political economic power. So it's a very invisible city in the imagination, but it's a very strategically important city. And second to petrochemical production, construction is the biggest economic power, and there's a proliferation, there's a flood of condos taking place as well. By the way, these condos, a condo like this, depending on where it's located in the city, can cost $1 million, which I can't afford. Right? These are in an undesirable part of the city, and they only cost $450,000 for these condos. But here's how the flood works. This is what's called the Second Ward, East End of Houston. It's a historically Latino community that dates to the early 20th century, and that's where the Church of the Virgin of Guadalupe is located. When a condo construction company sees this as a great venture, right? You want to take the risk. You want to take the risk of investing, and that's the risk we celebrate, right? The risk of the investor. There's a moral economy to risk. Some risks are worth taking. You make the risk of investing in these condos, and the risk that you take is whether people will buy them or not. That raises property values all around. And these people who bought these houses, who have inherited these houses over 3 generations, all of a sudden they can't pay their taxes anymore. And the condo company wants them out because that's lowering their property values, right? Because people who live in condos don't want to look and see this, right? Because these are Latino families who are very humble. So all these people are being priced out. They're being kicked out. And for some people, that's ethnocide, right? It's a historically ethnic neighborhood that's central in terms of the identity of Latino and Chicano families, and they're just being pushed out. They just simply cannot afford to live there anymore, so they have to sell their homes, and then the condo companies buy them and put up more condos. So there is other kinds of floods, right? There's other kinds of risks that people in Houston are living in, but if you only stick to flood risk can become a hegemonic kind of discourse about risk, that you completely ignore all of these other things that people are living through. And then we can talk about flood risk itself, right? And one of the things about the condo construction is that, in thinking about risk, is that in the United States, particularly in areas that are flood prone, the Army Corps of Engineers actually does involve in that the risk is something that is actually calculated in the United States, right? And anthropologists don't think that risk is a calculation. Like I'm saying, it's more of an arena of contestation. But for the Army Corps of Engineers, risk is something that you should be able to calculate, and you need to calculate. So the Army Corps of Engineers will go and create maps, and they'll create estimations. And they'll create these flood maps that differentiate between what's called a 100-year floodplain and a 500-year floodplain, and that affects the kind of insurance that you can get. And a 100-year floodplain is an area that has a 1 in 100 chance of flooding in any one particular year, in a 500-year floodplain scenario that has 1 in 500 floodplain risk. But that has to be calculated, and that involves a techno-scientific process of civil engineering of First, you have to know what the rainfall patterns are. You have to know how much precipitation there will be. Second, you have to know the hydrology of the region. You know, the different soils, the different channels, the different watersheds. Third, you have to know and anticipate and predict land use patterns, because if you do things like, if you take a wetland or you take a forest, you cut it down, you put in pavement, you put in impermeable surface, you just double the amount of runoff water that you will have, and you just double people's flood risk, right? Like there's an exponential relationship between installing impermeable surfaces like parking lots, roads, and flood risk. The problem with Houston is that in most parts of the United States, it's the Army Corps of Engineers who is pretty good at doing this. But in Houston, it's not the Army Corps of Engineers, it's the Harris County watershed district. In the Harris County watershed district, what's emerging from our ethnographic interviews is that residents keep on saying, these risk maps do not represent reality. Because if you are a real estate developer and you take the risk of investing in a condo unit, and you build that within an area that's in a floodplain, you're going to have a real difficult time selling it to someone because people don't want to live in a place where it floods. So real estate developers exert all kinds of pressure, and real estate developers are the primary contributors to mayoral campaigns in Houston. So they get all kinds of special favors from local government, from the planning authorities to the mayor, and they exert pressure to make sure that the sites of their development schemes are not included within the flood maps. So the flood maps do not represent risk reality. What the flood maps represent is the politics of real estate development and the political economy of real estate development. And this is something that for Houstonians is creating tremendous levels of uncertainty. The overwhelming majority of the properties that flooded in Harvey were outside the 100-year floodplain, because the development practices of the city had altered the landscape so much that there was houses outside of the floodplains that were actually flooding, not because of the hydrological composition of the region, but because of the huge bonanza and lack of observance of flood control mechanisms. Now, I could keep on talking about this for hours and hours. We're already over time. I just wanted to give you a sense of the information that's coming in, and again, what it means to think anthropologically about risk, right? And of course, this also it begins to problematize Beck's notion of the risk society, because if Beck is talking about a risk society, then all Houstonians, or Houstonians in positions of political power, will be reflecting on these secondary risks, right? And if we look at vital system security, vital system security is defined, then this would be the purpose of government. A government in Houston, if it's a biopolitical or vital system security type of government, they will be constantly reflecting on these secondary risks. And when you actually go as an ethnographer and you look at what's going on, they're not doing that at all. This isn't a risk society at all, right? This isn't a vital system security society either, right? And so how do you describe that? And certainly this is an experiment in free market development that is taking place, where certain forms of risk-taking are being exalted as that recipe for success that is Houston, and the disaster itself is not helping people reflect on it. And this is creating a tremendous struggle for Houstonians, because what the struggle now is, Houstonians it's really difficult. If you are buying a home in the United States is the largest investment that you will make in your life, and it can wreck you financially. And you need to know whether it's going to flood where you buy your home or not. And some of the people that I've been interviewing, they bought homes in areas that were not within the floodplain. They didn't buy flood insurance. Their homes flooded. They didn't have insurance, so they were stuck with the payments. And now they are having to take out additional loans and additional mortgages. So there are people who are currently paying 2 mortgages simultaneously, one of a house that's been damaged and they no longer live, and another one in a house where they actually live. And this, in the ethnographic narratives that we've been conducting, speaking about the parts of emotions, people will become, whenever there's rain in the forecast, people will become emotionally distressed. People are living with severe stress and anxiety over the uncertainty. Because if it was about risk, then they would know the probability of where they're living, but they don't even know what the probability is. And the challenge that is taking place is that the rains brought by Harvey, and this is what we're going to see with climate change, right? The rains brought by Harvey were completely off the charts, in terms of what was expected. So the problem with devising future risk maps in Houston is that we are 8 years away from having any estimation because of the time that it would take, and the fact that the maps themselves are politicized, and the time that it will take to actually be able to draw a map, and a map that might not even represent what the world looks like, because with climate change, we don't even know what the rates are going to be like. And that's what it means right now to be an average person homeowner in Houston. Right? So again, looking at risk again as this contested arena, right? Who gets to speak about what risk is? How do they speak about it? And how does that trouble some of the accepted notions of what the risk society is and biosystem security is? Because I think something that's coming out of this work, that yes, Vitis, I better get to writing the book. I just need time.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you very much.